tale of Uyanané, a land to the far east, in a river delta with lush, dark forests, begins with the old Dewari realm. A realm of legend that has been called the Kushumer of the East, fallen into nigh oblivion ere Kushumer ended, and the presumed origin of the Jaresal, which occurred during a warring period and scraped the belongings and memories of the old Dewari society. The Dewari are assumed to have been a separate caste, or a group of foreign occupants, though most of what was left after the Jaresal are stories of their downfall. What endured to this day, if not in original form, is their writing, which continues to live in the cults of Uyanané. Dewari script never formed an alphabet. In fact, Uyanané is a form passed from Kushumeri, or rather a counter-creation that simply uses adapted Dewari symbols. Instead, Dewari script contains a series of shapes that seem to connect entities to experiential states, thus forming complete statements. However, Dewari lay writings do not seem to tell stories, rather they seem to have been placed functionally and almost exclusively in what is understood to be temples, which were built in seemingly remote locations, and interestingly never around Peitorisi. So it seems they, as Kushumeri symbols, had ritual function. What is surprising is that in some places masses of variations have been found, first believed to have been writing exercises, almost as if the Dewari were searching for a truth and behold it in writing. To a scholar's eyes, it is clear that they have been abstract and inquisitive in their thinking, though they never built a military empire or made advances in trade and bureaucracy as did the Kushumeri. Dewari symbols are still a given in the daily life of the Uyanané, for they are prominently displayed by the old cults, which are referred to as Dewari Kore, as many believe them to be identical to the old creed of the Dewari. I am doubtful of this, for even if the priests of the Dewari Kore often use old symbols to refer to their gods, it is apparent that they do not know of their meaning and seem to use them at random. So if there was a link between Dewari Kore and the Dewari, it has been severed and forgotten. The central concept to all Uyana belief is the distinction between Nila, which can be translated as shape, and Hua, experience. Human life was understood as a union of Nila and Hua, specifically as one where Hua is bound to Nila, in the sense that the human mind does not get to choose what it experiences. It is simply bound to experience whatever entities and events in the world it is exposed to. This state of being was distinguished from one where Hua was liberated from Nila, where experience was no longer bound to shape. This state characterized the Amisi, the gods of the old Dewari cults, whose experience was believed to be untangled from the state of the world, allowing them to indulge in eternal bliss at will. Each cult prayed to a different Ami, and they were revered in equally different ways, but the shared pinnacle was a public procession called Daring Asher. The protocol of the Daring Asher varied according to the cult, but a common feature was that a priest lent his shape, that is his body, to the patron Ami, thus becoming an avatar of the goddess. He was then set in a vehicle and carried a pilai through the streets, allowing everyone to touch it to receive the favor of the Ami, after throwing an offering to the Ami onto the carriage. The Pilaisi themselves were surrounded by different myths in Dewari folklore, but were always meant for a group of priests to convey the blessings of the Ami. The intent of prayer and ritual sacrifice in Dewari Kore always was to invite an Ami to assume or influence shape in the world, and for this the Ami, being shapeless by nature, had to be offered a shape which allowed or inclined them to manifest in the world and bend fate in the believer's favor. The shapes offered represented pacts with the Amisi, and though being shapeless, they were usually depicted with historically renowned shapes that were offered to them in great Dewari legends. In such way, the Amisi functioned as omnipresent stewards, mystery holders, and shapers of the world and its history. In fact, the old Dewari cults are also called Chi Amideheshir, which means thousand faces of the Amisi, meant both as a nod to the various manifestations of the Amisi and the myriads of different cults. The latter were in constant rivalry for worldly recognition, and because the display of riches was evidence for a wealth of sacrifices and consequently the assurance of godly favor, the Daring Asher evolved to be pompous parades meant to further the cult's prestige and humble its rivals. Above all, the cults competed for the favor of the worldly rulers, who in turn sought for the allegiance of the cults to secure godly favor for their endeavors. Thus, worldly and spiritual ambitions were interwoven in ever fiercer competition, and we must imagine Uyanané in the early classic age as a world torn apart by conquest and vanity. This may have further enforced the idea of human life as a fate in shackles, and the traditional response was to give ever greater offerings to the Amici to gain the upper hand over the assault of hardships, thus tragically fueling their persistence. In times of war and misery, it is no surprise then that many spiritual seekers became frustrated by the cults and started to leave the cities, many with the intent to cease aiming to wield influence over shape, but rather to search for an escape from it. Many sought refuge in forests and old Dewari temples. For at this time there were already many myths around the Dewari See, amongst them those that proclaimed that they had discovered the mysteries of being and transcended Nila to attain godhood. From this collective search, a new creed was born. It began with the flight of Kemo and Visha, a married couple whose children had fallen victim to the struggles, who sought refuge in an old Dewari temple, where they joined the ranks of a group led by a former priest who had left his cult and taken his army's Pelai with him, a token of guidance on the path to godhood. Upon his later death, the couple advanced to become the new leaders of their cult and custodians of its Pelai. But their search was as fruitless as that of their predecessor. It is told that they eventually rejected the personal quest for godhood, instead seeking liberation for all beings in remembrance of their past children, and left the temple to retreat into the mountains. There, they used the Pelai to advance in their shared spiritual practice, rather than to pray to its army, until at last they attained liberation together. In that moment they glimpsed beyond Nila, shape, and saw the timeless and undivided ground of Hua, experience itself. Yet unexpectedly, their gaze was not left unreturned. Something stared back. It is said that at this moment their experience was united with that of all others who had before and after them transcended shape and found untainted oneness. The Uyanané speak of them as the Anahuati, the timeless masters, beings so realized that they rest outside Nila in timeless freedom. They are neither someone nor no one. Their state is Anahua, not same, not different. When Kemo and Visha returned from their mountain refuge, they started teaching their practice to other spiritual seekers. The guiding thought of the emerging creed, which would later be called Uyanané, was the identity of Nila and Hua, the idea that shape is experience, that Nila is a mere state to which Hua falls so that worldly experiences emerge. The radical consequence of this idea was that freedom meant not to escape Nila, to leave one's bodily presence so as to choose one's experiential states at will, but to simply see through the illusion of shapeful experience, experience divided into an experiencing mind and an experienced world. This also meant that all individuated experience, even that of an army, was to be considered ultimately unfree, and the Uyanané indeed drew a stark distinction between the Anahuati and the Amici, that they thought of the Dewari gods as having mastered Nila, when instead true liberation was to be gained by mastering Hua. Turning common belief onto its head, the Amici were thought to be oblivious about the true origin of shape in experience, and be thus bound to shape most strongly, so while they could form and assume shape, their freedom was relative, and some schools believed that the Amici would perish with the world to then reshape it again and again. The advent of Uyanané also introduced several beliefs about the Pelaisi. The most important one was that the liberated mind was in the same state as an untouched Pelai, Anahua, free of division between an experiencing mind and its contents. Untouched Pelaisi could thus be considered as the ultimate clues. If people could perceive them for what they were, they would immediately reach liberation. But since the Pelaisi did not contain shapeful experience, there was nothing there to be seen. This also meant that Kemo and Visha could not convey their liberation through a Pelai, since it pertained a shift of experience itself. But it is said that the moment right before reaching Anahua provided a clue for advanced practitioners. Thus, spiritual schools and pedagogies formed around the idea of providing shapeful clues, paradoxical forms of experiences in that they were shapeful but allowed to transcend shape. A consequence of this idea was also that the fully realized mind does not leave an imprint on an untouched Pelai, which was thus considered to be the ultimate spiritual trial. Some even thought of the Peitorisi as worldly emanations of the timeless masters. The idea being that a being reaching Anahua would conjure a vessel of pure experience, capable of holding the experiences of others. An interesting consequence was that, as far as the world was concerned, the Anahuati were the Peyatorisi, for that was all that there was to their shapeful being. Theoretical musings aside, the teachings of Khemu and Visha spawned a number of different spiritual schools. Each of them was led by an Atiyana, a lineage holder that guarded the Pillai until, upon their nearing death, they would choose a successor. Only the Atiyana was allowed to freely interact with the Pillai in moments of greatest insight, to leave clues for other practitioners. These would then be granted access at key steps of their spiritual development. A common mark for practitioners of this new creed was the Hoemaha, a double bracelet that was given to monks and nuns during an ordination ceremony, where they would first be granted access to the Pillai by the Atiyana, who was bound to the ordinated through the Hoemaha. In an ethical sense, the Hoemaha signified a bond to all sentient beings, and this idea gave these schools the name Angteye, which means tied knot. The different schools of the Angteye were divided not only over intellectual questions, but also over their stance on who was eligible to access the Pilaisi. Over time there emerged great carrying schools that opened their Pilaisi to larger groups of laymen in ways not too different from the Daring Asher, and some of these found rather quickly that allowing worldly leaders to interact with their Pilaisi was a suitable way to gain worldly influence. Thus, despite their stark intellectual disagreements, Uyana schools and Dewari cults found their way into a symbiotic coexistence in Uyana society. The common practice was that a family would continue to make sacrifices to the Amisi for the accomplishment of their worldly concerns. This, however, was now seen as playing with fire, as it came with an affliction to Nila, shape, which both required justification and a counteracting effort towards detachment from Nila. A noble person thus had to strive for balance between sacrifice, in the sense of knowing when to appeal to the gods for justified reasons, and restoration, in the sense of knowing how to remedy affliction through spiritual advancement. These qualities did not need to be united in one and the same person. In fact, a good ruler would take sacrifice upon themselves so that their entrusted would not have to, and thus create the conditions for their restoration. In Uyana society, the title Bama referred to a person of power, someone who was both expected and entitled to sacrifice, which usually referred to a patriarch. In extension, Shibama, Great Bama, was an honorary title for Uyana royalty, and Rishi Bama, Greatest Bama, a title for the ruler of a realm. The Bama subordinates were in turn expected to master piety, to honor the act of sacrifice, and use the conditions for restoration. In a concrete sense, this could mean sending one's offspring to a monastery. Another consequence of the infusion of Uyana beliefs was that, since great success suggested godly favor and therefore plenty of sacrifice, it also came with greater moral expectations towards restoration, meaning reckless pursuit of personal ambitions was increasingly frowned upon. Thus, Uyanané in the Classic Age continued to be a land of 10 kingdoms, 100 schools, and 1,000 cults, enmeshed in a competition that stretched from material to spiritual and artistic domains. But while the emergence of Uyana Kore did not upend the constant struggle, it had a moderating effect, leading to a balanced and somewhat orderly state of semi-violent competition. By the late Classic Age, a schism formed within the Uyana schools, championed by a group of intellectual leaders who called out their peers' complacency within the worldly power system. They ridiculed the Angteye's ways as a form of shackled liberation, and their initiation rite consisted of burning the Hoemaha, not to reject the Angteye's devotion to other beings, but to reject what they thought of as a spiritual illusion of an alternative to complete liberation from Nila. This gave them the name harataya, which means burned not. Monks and nuns of the harataya covered the head with ash as evidence for the discarded Hoemaha, and in a metaphorical sense for their dedication to burn out shapeful experience, by which they meant an irreversible eradication of individuated consciousness. In their rejection of Angteye pedagogy, they believed that one could not reach liberation from Nila through Nila. The Pilaisi were thus no longer used as spiritual tools. The harataya were keen on engaging in spiritual dispute, which gave birth to a series of cosmological ideas. The central one was that since the state of Anahua did not know any division, one could ultimately not speak of it as an experiential state of an individuated being, but only as a state of the world, or rather the world was to be understood as a state of Hua. Most harataya believed in an historical descent of Hua into Nila, which meant that mankind was in the process of losing access to the Anahuati, so that eventually liberation would be impossible. Looking back onto Dewari culture, they believed in an original human world built after the Amisis design that had to burn and would be reborn in lesser forms until an eventual burning of the world itself. Some believed that from the ground of Hua, a new world would be born, while others rejected this cyclical model and proposed a final burning or a perpetual decline. An important event for the harataya were Peitorisi burnings, not only for their symbolic meaning, but also because they granted insight into the state of the world. The harataya understood that harvesting Pelaisi endangered the life of a Peitora, so they maintained a number of secret Peitorisi sites deep in the forests. A pilgrimage to these and a ritual repetition of the Hoemaha burning during Peitorisi burnings was an important event that gathered the different schools for dispute and reflection on these shared impressions. The Peitorisi burnings were also used to celebrate the passing of accomplished spiritual role models who were honored by cremation in the Peitora burning. The emergence of the harataya upset the fragile balance of spiritual and worldly powers in Uyanané. They were embraced by a few of the powerful and banished from some realms, and the reaction within the general population remained ambivalent. While their promise was that everyone could reach liberation, and attachment to power was corruption without exemption, they remained an intellectual elite with a rigid doctrine that allowed for no easy passive membership. Still, in some realms they were appreciated interlocutors, sought after as uncorrupted, neutral advisors and mediators, and people at the end of their career or ousted from it came to join them to seek liberation, be they merchants, craftsmen, bureaucrats, or even priests. Over time, the harataya found their place as respected schools fully devoted to spiritual practice, that were however kept at distance to not upset the status quo, and many of their supporters and followers remained secretive. To the harataya this was more than acceptable, for while their practice and rituals had a social side to provide guidance, ultimately spiritual practice was solitary and social standards were meaningless. Only one change is said to have caused their anger, which is that the Angteye before long invented a Hoemaha made of metal.